All right. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Sweet. Alrighty. Excellent. It is working. So we will. Hello, Amy, who first commenter of the day. Yeah. So wherever people are hopping on from, I know this is a different time than normal. Doing the hurricane redo session.
Right.
But if you can only be for part, or if you're watching this later, then I'm guessing you found it on the resource page. But alrighty, let me hit record and pull up. There we go. Excellent.
Texas.
Oh yeah, there we go. We got Blue Ridge, Texas, joining the stream. Stuart, Northampton, England, Music City, St. Petersburg, Florida. That's near you, Brian.
It's just 3 hours away.
But yeah, hello everyone. This is Tripp, and I'm here with Brian, and this is the concluding Q&A about for Do I Stay Christian, Brian's newest book. And I don't know where I said it, so I don't have a prop, but I promise it exists in digital, physical, and audio form, which we made a host of little videos, around 25 minutes or so, to kind of prompt discussion for people that are using it in this online group we've been running, but also in different congregational and community settings. And we've been doing Q&As with people asking questions inspired by the book. And this week is we're going to attempt to go through some of these questions that were generated in conversations around the book, but aren't as specific about specific sections and passages. But first off, Brian, we didn't anticipate you joining for the last session, and then you surprised Tom Ord and I, who was filling in, and we had fun. But I'd love to get an update just on how you, Grace, and your neighbors are doing post hurricane.
Yeah, well, thanks, and I was surprised I got to join you for that, because we had in the aftermath of the hurricane, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have internet, and we didn't even have cell service. So it was pretty weird. We had to drive like 20 to 30 minutes to park in a Walmart parking lot where there was a little bit of a cell signal, and then we could hitch our other devices to that. So it was a crazy couple of days. And our home is at high enough elevation. We're over 12 feet, so we had no storm surge damage, minimal wind damage. But really, I'd say probably for about 100 miles of the Florida coast, if you drive down any residential street, there'll be and that's at low elevation, under 15 to 10 feet, depending. You'll see lines of refrigerators and carpeting and moldy drywall that had to be pulled off walls, and obviously all kinds of vegetation, debris, and so on. But yeah, it still looks like a kind of a war zone, even though the weather's beautiful, and we're through the worst of it, of course. And there are over 100 people who've lost their lives, and there are thousands and thousands of people whose homes were destroyed.
Well, yeah, I'm it is the cleanup and stuff after that is something that goes on for a while, and
years.
The way we're responding to our climate emergency doesn't Doesn't lead me to think it's going to get any better anytime soon.
No, and years ago, I had probably 8 years ago, a friend of mine in the environmental world. We were talking about how bad things were for in gaining momentum on climate change, and he said, "Well, we have one very persuasive voice who's really on our side." And I said, I was thinking, is he talking about Bill McKibben or Barack Obama, or is he? And he said, "It's the Earth, you idiot." He said the climate itself is going to speak louder and louder till nobody can ignore it. And I think that's even here in Florida, that's beginning to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, so we have a number of different questions, and there are a couple different groups who have been going through the book together and joining in the sessions that asked a very similar question. I'm going to read Wes's because he, I think, put it. Well, actually, I can actually play it. I forgot he sent me the audio clip, but he, put it directly in such. Here we go. Oops. I gotta hit the Bluetooth button. But yeah, have you had lots of have you got to contact, been in contact with groups that have been using the book in discussion?
Yes, heard from lots and lots of folks.
What's the predominant response been from groups, or the different kinds of responses?
Yeah. So I'm sure somebody's had a bad experience with the book. That's just inevitable, but I haven't heard about any bad experiences. Someone just tweeted the other day, their group just had their first meeting, and he said there was really open conversation, and there were tears, and it was a very meaningful exchange. Somebody sent me a really detailed critique of 2 of the chapters. He was in a group that was discussing it, and he offered a critique. I got to say, it was a great critique. And that tells me that the group really engaged with it deeply. So, yeah, there's been some good, very good feedback. I've heard a few people in a few groups felt I was too hard on Christianity in the first 10 chapters. So if they only knew.
If they only knew.
Yeah.
All right. Well, here's Wes's question, and he is, he actually gives us background when he puts it.
Hey, Brian, this is Wes Mullins, and I am a pastor at a metropolitan community church in St. Louis. We have a mostly LGBTQ plus church of about 160 people, and I've had 20 people sign up to read your book with me over the last 6 weeks. These folks are largely folks who are barely hanging on as Christians. They want to stay part of the church for the community, but they're really struggling to see how it is the best place for the long term. As you wrote, the Judeo-Christian story is a first axial age story, and we are evolving. And so the question is quote unquote church still church if we reject much of the story? As one of my church members put it last week, are we really just supposed to call ourselves Christians while we reject, ignore, or heavily reinterpret a large portion of the story of the Bible? For me personally, as the pastor, I'm really struggling with this as well, as I've come to not really believe a lot of the core tenets of Christianity, and don't know how I can still call myself a Christian pastor and do the work that I do. Even though I love it, even though I have so much passion for it, I feel a bit like a fraud on many Sundays.
All right.
What a lovely question, asked in such a beautiful spirit. Wes, what I would say to Wes is, first, I feel the same way sometimes, and other people feel the same way about me sometimes. A quick anecdote. I was speaking, I think it's the only time I've ever spoken in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And it was at a UCC church, and the audience there was very warm and welcoming to what I said. I don't know if there's a Baptist seminary in Oklahoma City or something, but there was a young fellow who I think was a seminary student, Southern Baptist or something similar. And at the end of the talk, when I opened up for questions, he was the first guy up to the mic and he was shaking. And I could just tell the poor guy was so nervous. He knew he was probably in a minority and how he felt. And it took a lot of courage for him to speak up. And he said, I just want to know why a heretic like you gives yourself permission to reinterpret the Christian faith into something it isn't. And I just felt like, good for you. You put it into words of how I'm sure a lot of your professors would feel and so on. So here's the thing. A Southern Baptist professor who would say to me that I was reinterpreting the faith, if he were to talk to an Eastern Orthodox bishop, they would say the Southern Baptists had done the same thing. And if he were to talk to a Lutheran, some Lutherans would say they had done the same thing. And so in a certain sense, the history of Christian theology is the history of, here's the thing, it's a history of change and development, but the old forms don't go away. They very often continue. They actually very often make changes too. They just make changes at a different pace than other people. So, so I guess part of what we have to say is a fundamentalist Christian defines Christianity one way. An Eastern Orthodox Christian defines it another way. A Roman Catholic, Southern Baptist, whatever. People have different definitions. And what that's going to require is that we become overt about our definition, the one that we apply to ourselves, or the reason why we would hold that name ourselves. And we don't have to say ours is the right one, theirs is the wrong. We just have to say, I understand by your definition, I'm not a Christian. I'm not going to play that game and tell you you're not a Christian by my definition, because my definition of being a Christian doesn't see that as a helpful or meaningful thing to say. So I don't know. That's what I'd say. But I would also say, and I'm especially thinking about LGBTQ plus people, I can see both reasons why LGBT community would want to retain their Christian identity. And I can see reasons why they'd say that's such a dangerous group to be associated with. For the sake of my own sanity and well-being, I just want to stay away. And I just think part of what it means to love your neighbor is to acknowledge that reality among your neighbors. I don't know, Tripp, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if people are honest about the history of the church, there's not a lot of opinions labeled heresy in the present, like at least within the Christian conversation, that someone with a saint in front of their name didn't have. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, even think of the kinds like theology nerds that gatekeep fight about. Like, there's a million versions of the Trinity with individuals saint in front of their name that are heretics. You have people with saints that believed in creation out of nothing and ones that didn't. Every different atonement theory, the ones that are too, awkward and robust and robust in ways that we're like, whoa. And then, others that, aren't. So in some sense, there's that initial getting your sea legs to the depth and breadth of the larger body of Christ in its history and in its context. Then the second step, I think, for giving yourself permission, if you choose to claim the identity, is realize that the reports we've been given from the history of the church are a very small portion of the church. And Wes, who's a minister, right? Like, this is one of the things I found as a minister when you tell the truth about these things. You find out, like, despite your amazing preaching, they actually don't all agree with you. Even 8 years in the same congregation, Brian, I thought by this point, they clearly are all like neo-Whitehedians that have cultivated a deep care for justice with a form of evolutionary panentheism. And and then I find out, no, a number of them are Jesus-flavored humanists, and others think I'm a heretic, but I'm really good at communicating that people are loved, And so just recognizing that, like, even in a congregation where the community is the reason people show up, there's a diversity of answers. Yes. And that's been the case for most of church history. We've even canonized 4 different gospels that don't line up if you were trying to, harmonize it. So one of the tasks I think about Christian identity in the present is internally acknowledging and honoring the diversity of the history and the diversity within the body of Christ present.
Yes.
And I think that's one side. The other side that a couple of the people that had similar questions and in my follow-up with Wes are more specific, which I'm interested as to what you're going to say, Brian. So we had Wes and I had an exchange, and Andrea, who's a Methodist minister, and I had an exchange, had similar questions. Because they say, oh, we aren't sure about certain teachings or basic teachings or the framing. And I'm like, well, which ones? Because the 2 metropolitan community churches I've been spoken are, we're very similar to the UCC church I worked at. And I'm like, I don't think half the church would have passed a generous orthodoxy theology quiz, Brian. But he said, what about some basic ideas like the resurrection of Jesus in us, or the salvific nature of Jesus? Maybe we get exemplary nature, or the sense that God is working out any kind of divine plan or narrative. Over the course of our conversation through the book, I think we sounded more and more humanist as weeks went on, causing us to wonder if the Christian identity still works. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like those are like, if the questions are, do I have to believe the things I thought my tribe told me I have to believe? No, because Christianity is a lot deeper and, broader. It's a different one when you go, I don't know about the reality of God's presence and action in history. Did God really do anything in Jesus we couldn't do for ourselves or someone else? How would you draw a distinction between those 2 kind of, do I stay Christian uncomfortability bits around theology and vision?
Yeah. Well, I suppose first, this is a fraught question, and any way I answer it, I will not be satisfied with. And so I won't be surprised if other people aren't satisfied too.
You did begin the book with 9 definitions of religion, right? So you could kind of answer this question right for each answer.
That's exactly right. So here's what I'd say. For people who take the Bible seriously, for whom the Bible is part of the conversation, the understanding of God you read about in Ecclesiastes, and the understanding of God you read about in Job, and the understanding of God you read about in Proverbs, and the understanding of God you read about in First Kings or Judges are really, really, really different. And so in a certain sense, the Bible itself stakes out a variety of understandings of God that exist in dynamic tension with each other. And one of the things that's happening now is that a lot of ideas about God that have been deeply rooted in the Christian faith have now been problematized for new reasons. So, I bet 100 years ago, the most liberal Protestant, if you'd said the fatherhood of God is a problem doctrine, the fatherhood of God was one of the unifying features that was pulling theological liberals together. They had no idea that within a few decades, the feminist movement would arise and serious critiques of patriarchy would arise, so that 100 years later, when people say the phrase, the fatherhood of God, other issues are in play than those issues that were 100 years ago. And here's where I think people can make 2 parallel mistakes. People can say, because you don't believe what people used to believe, you're not a Christian. Or because they didn't believe what we believe now, they were horrible, patriarchal, misogynist Christians. You see, it's the same kind of what people sometimes call chronological snobbery. Something that has helped me in understanding why people say what they say is to say, what kind of problems are they trying to solve? So there's a significant group of people who would call themselves not just Christian humanists, which, by the way, if anyone's interested, if you go online and Google Christian humanism, you would find out a lot of people that would have been a term that Erasmus, John Milton, the poet, many people through history would have been glad to apply to themselves as a Christian humanist. Um, the words meant something a little different back then, but there might have been similar impulses. But there's something called Christian atheist, right? There are Christian atheists or atheistic Christians. Well, then if you say to them, let's talk about the theos that you have problems with, we get into a really, really amazing discussion. So, and I know people would like me to offer some little key to make it easy. I will, but it won't make it easy. But
Yeah.
But here's what I'd say. If I meet someone who says, I really respect Jesus so much, I trust his wisdom so much that I would like to follow him with my life. I think he has something that could shape my life and give direction to my life. I have a feeling that would have been good enough for Peter and John and and so on. I'm okay with that, but what I would say then, oh, that's okay. You won't qualify as a good member of the Presbyterian Church in America, or that won't be enough for some Eastern Orthodox bishops, although there are Eastern Orthodox mystics that would love you and would be, accept you right where you are. So that's how I would respond to that.
Mm-hmm. So, this past year, the most downloaded homebrewed episode was one I did with Sarah Lane Ritchie called "Minimal Viable God Concept," and it's fascinating because for her, if people just go listen to the episode, it's great, but she has had an ongoing struggle. She's like, I tried to be a happy atheist and it didn't work. And we both were on religion science faculty together, had lots of conversations, and we were in a convent. She's like, I really feel like if you're going to use the word God and it means something, right? So this is how we had a long nerdy conversation about it. She was like, I feel like if you're going to use the word God, it should be no less than personal. However you envision ultimate reality should have the kind of attentive care that a loving human-to-human relation has. So it's not less than that, which is a criticism to a lot of ground of being type people that use ground of being as a substitute for God and don't predicate relationality and things of God. That God is transcendent, that it's not a name ultimately for the immanent. There's some form of transcendent, the gift of the possible, all these kind of things. And third, that God provides for post-mortem hope. And for her, it's like there are just too many lives that this loving ultimate generated that were snuffed out before any form of expression that ultimate be called good, then something else is demanded, right? And so that was like the most downloaded podcast, got tons of responses to it. And last week at Theology Beer Camp, she gave one of the keynotes, kind of laying out how you understand spiritual technologies developed in religious tradition scientifically, and then how a lot of us that grew up in particular context where you feel manipulated don't know if we should engage or use the kind of structuring things that religions learn to cultivate. And she's kind of challenging that's ultimately cynical because it's part of being human and you're opening yourself up. And at the end, she gave this line, which was re-quoted the most in like reviews of the event, which I was like, oh, this is beautiful. She goes, well, so people at the end keep asking me, do you believe in God? Do you believe in God? She's like, well, I'm not sure, but am I posturing myself in hope to be open to the divine experience and responding to the lure in love? Well, if that counts, then yes. And so I say all that because a lot of people, like people that take care of, to spend lots of nerdy time in those conversations, it's interesting to me the conclusions around ultimate reality and its relationship to religious traditions that get eliminated fast. It's kind of the if you just use your brain, there's obviously one, and its name is Jesus. The kind of religious God-splainers that are like worse than mansplainers because it includes all of ultimate reality. But equally, the ones that give these kind of because we've crescendoed as a species, we can now explain away mystery, the call to hope, and all these other kinds of things. And it's really just, what depends on what science you use to be reductive, but you explain away religion. And that's a kind of God-splaining as well. And I feel like if you're honest, and this is my experience spending a lot of time with philosophers and scientists the last 3 years, is if you don't have to pick one of the God-splaining options with that kind of certainty and finality, then those phobic of religious traditions are interested to the wisdom they have.
Yes.
And if you ask me, this is, my case, if I was wanting to stay Christian on days I'm not sure about an ultimate, like, is it worth giving yourself to a religious tradition that seeks to cultivate communities who practice kenosis, giving of self and abundance for the well-being of the whole? You're like, yeah. Like, should we think that when we pray, we use our enemies' names and not for judgment?
Yes.
Like, just start going through the things Jesus goes, if you follow me, we do this, like you were saying, Brian. And whether or not you can have conclusive, certainty at this point, I think is a bit much. But if you're going to take seriously the question of human existence and what we're going to do with our finitude, then I think the Christian tradition has particular ways of inviting us into these narratives and into these practices and into these stories. And I also think there are wonderfully beautiful things about other religious traditions as well. And so it's just so often we use our intellectual hesitancy to support our ultimately support our hesitancy around discipleship. And the thing I think most of the sages across religious traditions is that religion's not something you do epistemically distanced, as if it's something you get at and understand from afar. You actually learn what it is in community.
Yes.
Anyway,
and
I don't need a lapse into philosophy of religion lecture, but I always think, I just think it's important to acknowledge that there is not a set answer when it comes to this question. That
that's really well said. Really well said. I think in the background of all of these questions is this awareness that almost all of our religious institutions have tests of belief for acceptance, and there's a certain way that when you get I'm going to sound a little mystical or woo-woo here, but when you get a vision, when you get an understanding, when you see the possibility of a way of having faith that's not built around belief-based loyalty tests and belief-based purity tests and belief-based entrance requirements, when you get a vision for that kind of community, you in a sense don't want to stay in the arguments about minimum viable God concept forever, because at some point, the very act of having those conversations, which I would think is why that was such a powerful and popular podcast episode, the very act of having those conversations makes you more of a philosopher of religion. And think about the other things that are going on when we talk about God. And I think I can explain that with a little almost impromptu parable, that you imagine walking into some group of holy women and men in some, beautiful place where they've gathered, and you say to them, I don't know what you believe, and I'm not sure I agree with it. Would I be welcome here? And they would say, well, what we believe is that we should love you, whatever you believe, and welcome you, whatever you believe, because you're a precious human being. Once you can imagine that, it makes other things possible. It's almost like we keep playing a game that we don't really want to play because it's the only game we know about. And part of this process many of us are going through is imagining a different game with different rules. I don't know if that works or not, but
Yeah, I think I think it's helpful, and with me, especially when I was in a congregation, and all the all the intellectual processing that happens through graduate school and all that kind of stuff. I remember thinking, what are the boundary lines where I would not feel comfortable serving as a minister, which is real different than if I would participate, in a Christian congregation.
yes.
But it was in that where I was having a meal with Roger Haight. He's a Catholic Jesuit theologian. He wrote a book, Jesus, the Symbol of God, which is one of the best Christologies from the late 20th century. But he wrote anyway, wonderful theologian. Got censured by the Catholic Church because he said symbol. And he was like, well, I could have just said sacrament, but I actually wanted people that weren't Catholic to understand it. Anyway, he's a great guy. But he and I were having a conversation, and I was struggling with this, and he goes, "Oh, Tripp, some days I if I'm honest, I don't really know when I'm supposed to know as a priest. And that's when Protestants need to have Catholic friends, because your job there is not to tell everyone what you believe, and your belief somehow helps everyone else keep their own belief." He's like, that creates a really horrible, sick relationship, because then you, the minister, have to feel like you can't tell the truth and all these kinds of things. He goes, I think you should tell the truth every time you exegete and all that kind of stuff. But one of the gifts of the Eucharist, and one of the gifts of baptism, and one of the gifts of the prayers of the church, listing it off, one of the reasons you begin, sing the doxology and all that is because you don't have to find the words all the time. But you've decided together in a space where, should it be true, this is worth gathering. And he goes, so when who is it that serves a meal? It's not you. He said, when people do confession and I say your sins are forgiven, I'm not doing it, and he's going through this and goes, so one of the gifts of the Christian tradition, whether or not you ultimately believe all the time it connects, is that it is a community where he said, when we are being ourselves, we welcome each child they're baptized, knowing they bear the image of God. It's our task to love them. And when everyone leaves, we pray the same prayer, whether they are the queen or they're the serf. And when you come with a broken heart, we say your sins are forgiven, and we send you out to live differently. And he's going through, he goes, and those words, you don't get to pick. And I just, and he goes, it's the best thing you could ever do. Because, he was like, I've had all kinds of doubts. And I find that to be something that ministers understand. And now more and more congregants are having the kind of informed intellectual wrestling that framework could ultimately be helpful.
Yes. Yes. What this will involve, though, is an open discussion about the role of beliefs in Christianity that I don't think we've ever been able to have before. It was just too dangerous and too tricky. But I think we're coming to a place where we can, and that's going to turn more and more of us into philosophers of religion, Tripp, because we're going to have to realize that our very understanding of what religion is being challenged and shaped and expanded. People, if people are interested in seeing that kind of acceptance of people, I'll tell you a book that I think really communicates it well. I think Frank Schaeffer, and Frank is a dear friend. I have to say, I'm an absolute raving fan of his trilogy of books that begin with Portofino. I think it's called the Calvin Becker series. But he has another more recent book that is raucous and wild and hilarious and off the leash. It's called And God Said Billy. And it's this raucous story, but it ends with this kind of encounter where someone finds himself in the presence of a kind of spiritual acceptance that he's never experienced from another human being before. And it opens up different possibilities. And I think in many ways, this is where our own theological discussions are always related to our own biography, what it is we're trying to recover from, and our own sociology and history, what's going on in our larger world. So we're trying to solve problems with these discussions, and 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 that's why the discussions themselves have value, and not just the answer that we come to.
Yeah, that story reminds me of John Cottingham.
I
He's
don't.
he is a he's the preeminent Descartes scholar, but he's also
Uh,
the most cited living philosopher of religion. He retired now, but I think he was at Cambridge for a long time. He wrote this book, a series of books on belief and on religion, and when you get done as an academic and you can say what you want because you've
yes.
already done enough footnoting, and he tells a story similar to that, but how a philosopher would. He would say often when talking to undergrads smitten with whatever they just learned in their empirical science class, would come in and go, "Oh, Dr. Cottingham, is this true about some religious practice or some tradition?" And asking is it true question prior to being formed by it is like asking someone to marry you. A promise of a life of love and fidelity, and you ask that question on the first date. He said, faith, like love, is something you must know the meaning of before you can say yes. And I think I love that image, and that's why I really like the way Wes framed it. It's like we are a community, we are inspired, trying to live faithfully in Jesus. We're wrestling with it, and sometimes we sound too humanist, and we wonder whether or not we belong. And in some sense, I would rather just go like, no. If you're a community that's actually trying to embody the way of Jesus, and that's animating you, then you probably should be the ones that belong more than the ones that are cutting you out for your fidelity, especially in a context where you are going to be being ostracized in certain parts of the country for being an LGBTQ centered congregation. Anyway, you can sometimes ask, like, why are the gatekeepers the ones who have the ugliest practice telling us what it means to be faithful to Jesus when he was so good at pissing off gatekeepers? He brought politics, religion, society, and culture all together to take him out. Anyway, but yeah, that John Cottingham line I like a lot, and it made me the Schaefer story I think really connects to it.
I love it.
Do you think a couple of the other groups asked, how would you change the way of introducing the content of the faith when it's not final and singular and certain? Especially if you think of the kind of normal rhythms a lot of congregations have. Sometimes, the task involves reframing what we do, right? So you don't hear some of the same language, words, prayers, and activities as boundary maintenance and threats. But when it goes to spiritual formation, Christian education, these kinds of things, if we're more honest about how live the question, do I stay Christian? Or for those that haven't been, why would I become one? How do you envision changing and the nature of spiritual formation and education?
Yeah. Oh man. So, Tripp, as you say that, I think of a conversation I had, it's probably 7 or 8 years ago, with two pastors I really respect. And, I was a pastor for 24 years, and I know how important and how hard and how beautiful and how agonizing that work is. So, and they'd read some of my books. And anyhow, the three of us were taking this long walk. And I said, I said, if someone came up to you today and said, uh, I'd like to become a Christian, or however they wanted to put that into their own words, I said, what would you say to them? And what was so interesting is, as we walked along, the two of them start talking to each other, and they both said, we couldn't answer that question without asking the person questions. What are you seeking for? What makes you want to ask that question? And what was so interesting to me is that their pastoral life made them realize they would never answer that question without going into a deeper relationship with a person to find out what was going on in the person's life. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. There is something about this that maybe as we move forward becomes less of a little booklet that's modeled after a sales pitch, and less 4 steps or whatever, 4 laws or whatever, but becomes, this is a community that helps people on their spiritual journey, in their spiritual growth. And when you come and ask for help, they begin by asking you questions and they enter into a relationship with you. That just feels to me like there's something powerful there. So that would be one answer I would say. For people to say that's way too airy-fairy, I understand people might say that. I might say, look, I'd start by talking about Jesus, and I'd say, if I'd love to share with you my current understanding of Jesus and what it means to be a follower of Jesus for me, and that would become a process in sort of ancient terminology of catechesis. Um, and and if that person trusted me and felt that what I was saying was true, they'd keep asking more questions. And somewhere along the line, I'd say, hey, here's some more people I know. I'd love you to meet them too. And you can learn what you can, ask them the kind of questions you're asking. And what would happen to a person that got invited into that kind of community is they would be brought into a way of life that was not just answerable by propositions. Now, there might be propositions that would come along in that, but it wouldn't be like, my goal is to get you to say these 4 propositions, get you over that line. Whew, done with that one. Who's next? But it's inviting people into a way of life. That feels to me like what Jesus was about. I'm remembering, what was the name of Hippolytus's little document, I think from the mid-2nd century. It's anyhow, if people get a chance to read that, it sounds a little bit more like what was going on there, that there was a community that you were inducted into, and that there'd be a process of catching what they had. That seems to me to be how Jesus works with the disciples. Catch what I have, and now go help other people catch what you now have through me. So,
yeah, I definitely think that the centering of practice to understand the meaning of the narratives and the symbols is important. And when the content of the symbols and the stories and such was provided by imperial Christendom, then you would not really want the congregants to tend too closely to the prophetic energy of an oppressed people and a resurrected yet killed by the principalities and powers Lord, right? Like, so part of that, part of what we're doing is, part of the struggle I think we're in is we are detoxing from the way those have been occupied by visions of power that are antithetical to the cross. And it also means we should question how our communities and institutions are structured when the form of that structure was compliant with the political and economic systems that work against God's own, at least if you're a Christian, self-testified agenda in Scripture. So there's this, there is that predicament, and when communities of practice rediscover, restate the convictions, it just sounds different, and you get hung up on different questions. I think I told you this when we did our the 20 years after 9/11 class, but for 2 different churches over the 15 years I did confirmation, I redid the confirmation program where you basically spent the year doing experiments, doing what Jesus taught. And I, because they all knew I was a theology nerd with a theology podcast and stuff, people would always have really cool questions, and I would tell them to put them on a notepad and then stick them in a fishbowl, the big God bowl. And I never answered them the whole year. And I would just keep running over and say, oh, well, we'll get to it. We'll get to it. But over the year, you end up doing a series of experiments in truth with the teachings of Jesus. And if you get to the end and and I would tell everyone, oh, this year we're going to attempt to live together as if Jesus the way of Jesus invites us into life eternal.
Yeah.
And then at the end, if you want to be confirmed, you sign up. But like, I can't like give you a worksheet with explaining the Trinity.
Yeah.
And get it. Well, if you spend, a month praying for your enemies, and I remember writing out, we worked on writing a prayer for Osama bin Laden when I was in div school, not too long after 9/11, and we're invading. Yes. And you pray that. Then when it got to Confirmation Sunday, one of them led the church in the prayer. Now the church looked at us like, WTF, we should fire the new youth minister. And the more saintly figures of the congregation go, oh, like that, I was uncomfortable, and the most Christian thing that's happened here in a long time.
Yes. Yes.
And so when I pulled out their questions, like most 16-year-olds, does Gandhi go to hell at the end that had been in the bowl for the year? No one asked the question again, right? Like it's just a bad question if you were just doing what Jesus asked, and you're like, look, we're going to war, all these kinds of things, like, and the stories that are being told and all that. But only thing we really know is that we're to pray for our enemies. And so we write a prayer for Osama bin Laden, and we all do it. Well, if you do that, you already know the one Jesus called Abba is going to be disposed towards your enemies differently just by obeying. Yes. And I feel like those practices, that's like one example of thinking about how practices can kind of detox the content of the confessions.
That's beautiful. And if part of the spiritual formation process is to help people learn about the history of Christianity, I think one of the things we need to do is, I call this, along with many other people, non-dual thinking, so that we approach something and we don't just accept it or condemn it, but that we mash those together. And so for example, if we were going to look at the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, let's look at that and not hold it up as a test to see whether you pass the test. Let's try to understand what that statement, when it was being argued and debated and confirmed, what problems were they trying to solve? And then once we really understand what problems they're trying to solve, then we could say, what problems did this creed create? And how did people try to solve those problems? Or maybe we're trying to solve them now. And suddenly I think it helps people change from this, dualistic thinking of agree, disagree, confess, reject, to say, oh, we're part of a process. And to be a Christian is to be on this kind of journey of growth. And your goal is something is lit up in you by the life, the teachings, the story of Jesus. Something is lit up in you that says, I want to become something I'm not. I want to become something. I want to grow into something, and I'm not there yet. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes me think that line. I mean, Jesus says, blessed are those who are not offended by me. And Kierkegaard thought the opposite of faith isn't disbelief. It's offense. Because if you understand the invitation Jesus gives, it's to a community of being human in a different way. And what the offense isn't like, well, I don't know how they got the God and the human in the same place. It's not that kind of offense.
Yes.
The offense is that that the Christ is making this kind of demand upon you to walk in this other way. And I think that a lot of that language of discipleship in the teachings of Jesus and in the Gospels and stuff has been twisted because especially America, but largely the West in the Enlightenment, our notion of what freedom looks like and entails is problematic. And so if you, and this is one of the times, like I find the Reformed tradition and Augustine to make really, really good point. Freedom is not something that you have in isolation. It's something you have towards something. And true freedom is towards the ultimate God, love, Christ. And so to the properly ordered relations generate freedom. That is a very different picture of the self and the web of creation than saying, Well, freedom is like the ability to do as many things as you want and have the power and possessions and privilege to get away with doing it, or this kind of thing, or that your ultimate freedom is to fulfill your personal desires and personal this, that, and that. I feel like that the image of recognizing that for Jesus, it was the offense to the call that was opposite of faith, rather than, debates about how you work out the personhood of Jesus and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Here we go. Here's a fun one. Brian, this is for you. How do you plan to talking to grandchildren about the faith you inherited and the one you're hoping to hand on? When you think of that process, and I think a lot of people are familiar with you, coming to take leadership in a church that you're a part of and helping planning out of teaching literature, and then being a part of so many parts of the emerging church movement and connecting to more and more parts of the church globally and such. When you think of where you started, you shared some on the first night, and where you are now, what are the biggest differences of your understanding of the faith or the gift that you hope your grandkids get to encounter?
Yeah, I have 5 grandkids, so this is not a theoretical question for me, and I've thought a lot about what I would do differently with if I were a parent now, um, differently from when I was a parent, 30 years ago, 40 years ago in some cases. So um, I think one of the things that I would have to do now in our current context is I would have to, in a sense, I'd have to start as a philosopher of religion, Tripp, because I would have to explain to my kids what religion is and how it works in the world. And I don't think I could avoid it. And I think when the news comes on and they see people storming the Capitol with a Jesus T-shirt or waving a Bible as they shout, "Hang Mike Pence," or whatever it is, I'd see that as an incredible teachable moment to try to help them understand religion, that religion is a complicated and important and powerful thing in the world, and that one of their choices in life is going to be how they want to frame their life spiritually. So I would have one whole set of encounters with the issue of religion. I'd have another whole set of encounters with the question of with the experience of nature, and I might share with them some of my kind of God encounters, spiritual encounters through through nature. I might talk to them. I would have conversations about right and wrong and how that relates to an understanding of God and purpose and direction and so on in life, and responding to making mistakes and so on, which brings us to grace and forgiveness. And at some point, I would just want to talk to them, tell them about my commitment to Jesus and what he means to me and why I love him and follow him. And that would be in the form of testimony, So yeah, those would be it's the first things that come to mind. I've been thinking about this a lot because uh, my grandkids are really in that prime age now to have those kinds of conversations, and so times we're together give us opportunities for those conversations. But I also remember last year, two of my granddaughters were invited to a conservative evangelical Christian summer camp. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this could be a great experience for them. This could really be a horrible experience for them. And so it didn't work out for them to go, but they might get invited again this summer, and we'll have to have some of those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's really helpful because it's fascinating just in how you describe that. If you think of how insular religions want to protect the space where you're allowed to resonate with the divine or encounter the divine. And so part of what you describe is this going, here's how you encounter the heart of my particular religious tradition in a beautiful way. But then you also want to go, there are other axes of resonance. And where there are this variety of ones in connection to the created world, and then there are these other places you resonate with the divine in relationship to people that don't share the same animating narratives as you. And like, if you just think of the way you said it, it's like I want to like fix the paint job on the one I was handed, but there's all these other nesting dolls of beauty, and you can get all the way out to the big the big cosmic one. And that to me is, I think, one of the challenges the church hasn't figured out how to do outside of an intellectual space is like, what do you do with the fact that like everyone encounters multiple religious traditions and they're better humans than them, and all the stories that we have in scripture were written when they didn't know how old the earth was, that we're on a mediocre planet in a mediocre galaxy, we're not the center of the whole thing, and the cosmos is ginormous and expansive, and the histories are huge and diverse, and we have very little information about any of it. And yet, right, like the same line, the image of the firstborn of all creation, or the very same lines we would say in the same prayers they did then, just sound different because the world's different. And I don't, as someone who's very invested in religion science conversations, like, I don't find that it ultimately is like real invigorating when you wrestle with both. But like, there's nothing wrong with a person being and living and sounding like anyone else in their age. Right. There are better and worse versions of any context, but I just think it's funny, where we're in a different age and we haven't figured out how our liturgies and how the rhythms of congregations go. Like this beautiful narrative of the history of Israel and the life of Jesus and the movement of the Spirit in the church. How does that story also get nested in this other story of the cosmos, next to these stories of other religious traditions we never got to benefit from their wisdom before because we didn't know them, or we encountered them with our imperial agenda having occupied our stories? Like, there's nothing about Jesus that says we should actually be an imperialist. So maybe we shouldn't think that we're chucking the heart of Christianity if we actually think our neighbors can bless us and our enemies can be the place we work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Anyway, I feel like part of our task is that shifting, and people are, I know lots of people because of my situation. I know you do too, where you can start giving examples of people, different places being creative and things. But one of the parts I'm real excited about is like, as you start to see kind of pockets of people being creative and trying to gift the tradition again, informed by where we are in our moment, is like, when I hear about it, I'm excited. And then while plenty of people, especially someone that might join this group because they don't have a community that could do this group, they may feel alone and like, oh, I'm so glad I at least get to connect with people, in this online space. But as one perk of having a podcast and you getting, to connect with people, is we also kind of start getting excited about things that will have more permanence and inertia in 10 years or in 15 years. And so I would just say, if you feel isolated and things, like, start to connect and find people, where they are. And especially if they're young leaders and things, support them and trust them. But do know that there's tons of beautiful, exciting things happening. And I don't know what'll happen in the next 10 years, but in 10 years, the mind of Christ will still be something we should probably be figuring out as a collective how to embody. And if we don't, well, I'm real worried.
Yeah.
So
well said.
All right. We have two more questions, but one of them is the last one, where Mark said, I think you should let Brian ask any question he wants. And so you can ask any question you want for the last question. And I guess you can grade my response and then tell me how I should have done better. I don't know what Mark's setting up for. All right, let's see. Which one is unrelated to stuff we've talked about so far? All right. Here we go. Jenny says, when I got done reading this book, I feel like the church is currently telling everyone to trust them, just like Colin Powell explaining why we need to invade Iraq. And as we become more and more aware of these issues, we have yet to be honest about the lies that led us into war, and we have yet to be honest as a church of the way our power and influence in the world has been occupied for evil and pain. If we can get through the no section and recognize how important it is, how should the recognition of the no shape the prayer life of the church in public?
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
And the longer Sarah, because the longer bit of the email was how much our political life never allows public prayers of confession. And now that so much of religion's downstream from politics, it's like religious people are doing it. And anyway, but the Colin Powell image I thought was perfect.
It is, and it's inappropriate for me to go into, but I was a pastor in Washington, D.C. while that was going on, and a member of my church was part of that and came to me and said, I don't know what to do. I know that what he said today was false. And anyhow, there's a whole story that's part of my life relating to that. I'm just trying to think of where I should enter this, because this actually could lead to the question I want to ask you, Tripp. I wish you know how, as you've written a couple of books, you maybe have experienced this too, Tripp, but I have this feeling like after the book comes out and I talk about it for many, many, many hours, I think, why didn't I put this simple sentence in the book? And I put something close to it, but I would like to say that here's what I want to say. I don't think anyone should say yes to the question of staying Christian without also saying no. And I don't think anyone should say no without also saying yes. In other words, if I've done my job in the book, there's a way that people would feel simultaneously a no and yes. Well, as soon as I think that, I want to say, that's how I feel about being American. That's how I feel about being male. That's how I feel about being white. Like, part of what it means to be an adult is to own the complexities of identities. So, and part of this sort of circles back to something we talked about earlier. It's not just a matter of people gave me a definition of Christian that I want to say yes to and I want to say no to. I want to say yes and no to that whole definition. In other words, I want to challenge and question the definition, which the process of doing that makes me go deeper and deeper into the question, what kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to live? What path do I want to take? What do I value? And all I can think of is Jesus sort of standing at the in the sideline going, saying, finally, you're asking the question that really matters to me. What kind of people do we want to be? I may have lost the focus of the question, Tripp. You might need to bring me back to something, but that's
just about how kind of the public liturgies, the prayers, and the language of the church in public is so. How do we recognize our legacy and such, and be honest in ways that kind of the political liturgies of our time don't you can't admit failures, faults, miscites, and all those other kinds of things. And if we emulate that, then it feels like we're just setting up for continual embarrassment every time there's an oversight or failure, or we come to a new awareness in the future about a particular issue and such.
Yeah. 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 I think what Sarah was asking acknowledges that every element of the Christian faith has been problematized by Christian history and current Christian behavior. So there is no word that isn't polluted by the way it's been used by Christians. And if we say, for that reason, I'll throw the whole thing out, we are in a sense empowering the people who've polluted all those potentially precious things. So it seems to me one of our challenges is to take really seriously the pollution and corruption and harm and danger, the way that almost maybe every precious Christian term has become a Trojan horse in which hides all kinds of dangerous things. And at the same moment, for us to be able to say, whether I use that same word or not, what is the precious thing that I want to be sure we keep speaking about? What is the precious thing that I have to give testimony to? What is the insight or the discovery or the wisdom that I have to be one who speaks up about in the most positive way I can? Yeah, that to me is the challenge. On the issue of politics, what I want to say is, I mean, Sarah's question just puts it out there to say everything we say now, and it's probably always been this way, but people like me are just waking up to it. Everything we say has a political impact. And when you understand that, you understand every religious utterance doesn't just say something, it does something, and it prepares the way for something else to happen. So without meaning to, some very sincere person can hold up their Bible and say, Jesus saves, and the Bible is the word of God. And they might not realize it, but somebody might hang Mike Pence or somebody else holding up a Bible, and they could be playing a part in that. And when for many years of my Christian life, I was surrounded by people who were worried. We better not give up too much. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that's certainly a valid concern. But these days, I'm way more concerned that we're going to keep way too much bathwater around that's going to poison the baby. And and so this dilemma that the question struggles with is exactly the dilemma we should keep struggling with. And we can't give up. And we will never solve it. But this is the part of being human. When I feel that in my moment in 2022, I suddenly can imagine someone in 1863 or 1845 who living in the United States in a land of slavery and realizing that every pious thing they said was going to play a role in whether we faced the evil of slavery and racism. Man, so taking that political dimension seriously changes everything in the way we speak. And suddenly I go back and read the Gospels and I realize why Jesus spoke in parables, and I realize why Jesus uttered woe to you, and why, suddenly I see, oh yeah, Jesus gets that. That's the way he talked.
Well, yeah, Clarence Jordan it had this line. It was like, Jesus had to talk in parables, so he had time to get out of town before they figured out what he was talking about. And or they would have taken him out earlier. The thing that came to mind to me in thinking about, like, if you took the liturgy thing specifically, when I was in Los Angeles, the part of LA I was in was where a lot of the engineering for Raytheon, all the military and Boeing and all that kind of stuff took place. And during one Advent, we had a group of kind of creative writers, poets and such working on a lot of the prayers. And one in the Peace Sunday, one of the prayers of confession was this is during Obama's administration, and a lot of the news came public about like a pre-approved kill list, the increase of drones, and this kind of stuff. There was a specific line in the prayer of confession about our passivity as we learn about the increased use of drones and civilian deaths and all this other kind of thing. And the next church council meeting, one of our donors that works at one of these institutions was very upset and sent letters to the right people and raised it, at the church council. Like, look, I helped design these things, and I tithe, and blah 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 blah. And now you're telling me to pray for repentance. I design them. It doesn't mean I drive them. This kind of thing. Yeah. And Roberta Weaver, who recently just turned 100, very wise woman, said, well, what are we supposed to do? And because you could see everyone getting uncomfortable about thinking of the dollars attached to the person, but they don't want to be honest, and this kind of thing. And what are we supposed to do? And someone goes, well, but what is this individual going to do about it? They're an executive there and all this kind of stuff. They'll just replace them. It goes into this, let's be rational. And what are we going to do about it? It's like they didn't even design it thinking military initially, and going on so what, going through this list of let's be pragmatic and think about this. And then she goes, well, I think we should confess it nonetheless. And I just remember that line and go, when we get all hung up on our purity, and then we get vague about our confessions, then it actually leads us not to recognize the kind of complicity the larger system has us bound in. But once you start to see the way our economic system, our political system, and the fear that is harnessed through our media that pulls up on these kind of biologically given traits that helped us thrive in Savannah, hundreds of thousands of years ago, are now being actualized to generate tribal violence and ignorance towards the way we relate to the planet. If you don't start getting specific and confessing it, then what the hell's grace supposed to do? What the hell? You just go and in her line, well, you confess it. We confess it nonetheless. And I feel like there's a in confess it nonetheless is a confidence in the gospel that's not there when we don't take seriously the kind of question that was being asked about being specific or being public in our liturgies about the way we are entangled and complicit in all sorts of things.
It's situations like that come up so often. We really need, this is one of those things that we ought to have a little summit to figure out what our best response should be. So I don't know if this is the best response, but here's what I could imagine saying. We have a policy that when an issue like this comes up, we try to put it in terms of the pain that each person is feeling. So you are feeling pain that we confessed a sin that's related to your work. And you're feeling pain that we don't understand how difficult your life is. So let's make an agreement. For the next week, I'll think about my pain. I'll think about your pain, and you think about my pain. And then we'll flip it. In other words, one of the great things about that is we have two, kinds of pain. And what each of us wants to do is to get the other person to let us off the hook for the pain we feel. And maybe that in itself, we need a new way. We need to get wiser patterns of response to those kinds of pain, not simply backing down and not simply saying, tough luck, you corporate, scum or whatever.
Yeah. Well, all right. You get the last question there, Brian.
Okay. So Tripp, you've talked a few times about the great value, like that priest saying, I've got to get up there and say the mass, and I don't get any choice in the words. And I've got to lead in the Eucharist. I don't get any choice in that. And I feel the value of that. But I also feel that those words were written in a different universe, an Iron Age universe, or pre-Newtonian universe, a pre-American slavery universe. They were written in a different world, and they had a function in that world. How do you think we can find the same freedom to say the words that need to be said in our world that we've given them to say the words that need to be said in their world? How do we hold that balance of both valuing the tradition, but also acknowledging its contextuality, and then what that means for us in our situation? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, I guess, okay, there's two things that come to mind. One is most of the big ritual moments where the church, in some sense, speaks on behalf of God, like the affirmation of the value of life at baptism and these kind of things. When it does those are actually nested in very specific biblical texts that we can honor the intentions and gift of the tradition by re-exegeting and wrestling with those texts and giving it new words. So like a few weeks ago when I talked about my benediction that I've done for a long time, I mean, it is the shape of it is triune. It doesn't finalize the relations in the same way. And it's centered on the affirmation, the threefold affirmation that's there. And the three parts are centered on kind of the main three kind of 2.5 sacramental moments of a Protestant. But it also is the language that comes out of my experience of the divine, where I have I don't have the kind of hesitation I have in saying it. In baptisms, when I started working at a church that did infant baptism, I went through that process in thinking about the baptism in the baptism of Jesus and what that meant for his self-understanding as his vocation as the Messiah, what it meant for his understanding of of ultimate reality being Abba, and reworking a lot of what I would say and do there. It comes out of that space. So as opposed to how these narratives are like the narrative that we wrestle with in any text gets reinterpreted over and over. Yeah. And so the doxological expression that comes out of it, I feel like we can change and wrestle with it. And one way to set boundaries or barriers, right, of what we do is to return to the narratives those sacraments are nested in. So like the Eucharist, I never, unless my sermon was, if I do a sermon explaining why we should keep blood talk around, it's because all the liberation theologians think we should, right? It's not because you need to be washed in the blood or penal substitutionary atonement. Yeah. And so if I've done a sermon where I think everyone realizes that it's real easy for the privileged to get rid of blood language because it makes us uncomfortable because our shitty neighbors that use it to threaten us, that's different than people who bearing crosses today see the blood of Jesus as God's solidarity with them. And so in that space, then I might use it at the Eucharist. But if it's not, if I haven't reframed it, not using it. But is the story of the Eucharist one where Jesus is celebrating and calling his friends to fidelity, facing the powers where he knows they're going to abandon him and reject him and all that kind of thing. And what is he giving them with? A meal. And what happens at this meal? He gives it and then goes, this is the thing I want you to do to remember me. It is the meal for the deniers and the forsakers. And it's given, and it's given freely. And so I will retell it, but I will use his words, but I don't use the tradition words that focus on blood things unless I've already reinterpreted it. But if I did James Cone and John Sobrino, two different theologians that have argued white liberal Protestants get rid of blood for bad reasons, then I'll say, this is my blood of the new covenant poured out for you. Because what is the covenant? It's that the people of God are the people who've chosen the cross bearers in the world. That's where God shows up. What does it mean in America? Then the lynched bodies are the place we need to come to terms with. If we too don't want to be Peter or Judas, it takes like more work than just reading a prayer book. But I think you can do it in ways that honor the tradition and help help restate the animating energy of the biblical narratives.
Yes.
But I would say that the other part is, I think that there is a certain gift to not having to have the words all the time. And the process of the church's liturgical development is interesting because it's almost always been done in community. And so one of the tasks, and I know you've encouraged this in lots of places and such, is like when a community has a shared ethos of doing the work of crafting prayers and liturgies, so that the 40 Sundays a year, I think I'm going to have to cross my fingers part of the time or not tell the truth. And as I feel and all that, you go, no. There's a community of people that have encountered God mediated by Jesus. And we spent lots of time giving the gift of these words that we've wrestled with in community to you when you can't muster them. And I think that's a real gift. Sometimes it means you get to use really old words and know that they're backwards in some places. But I think we need to learn to trust the body of Christ in the present and cultivate like imagery, language, and poetry and such to do the same today. Otherwise, we're outsourcing divine creativity to an old committee. And knowing who's been on those committees, I think we could easily do better.
Hey, in that spirit, I don't know if you had a way to end this session, but I was just thinking I could use some of the final lines from the book as a bit of a benediction, if that makes sense to you.
Oh, yeah. I just want and then we want to make sure we let everyone know that they can hang out with us and Diana and Ilya Dilio and Grace G. Sun Kim in January.
Yes.
So I will. I'll put that in the chat, and you can. We can tell them about that right after you do the benediction. That'd be
okay. Well, actually, why don't we tell them, and then I'll do the benediction. Is that all right?
Yeah.
So Diana Butler Bass and I and another friend and colleague named Jim Chafee were invited to take over an annual gathering on the Georgia coast in January of every year. It's called Southern Lights, and you'll see a link there. It's Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. And amazing speakers. You can go to that little link and you'll see who the speakers are. And Tripp will be there podcasting, and Grace G. Sun Kim will be there podcasting. And if you like these kind of conversations, it's a beautiful weekend in a beautiful place in the middle of January. So.
Yeah. And Reggie Williams will be there, who, if people listen to the podcast, he's been on in a number of the groups. He visited in the Black Theology group and in the Bonhoeffer group. He's joined Diana and I before for Ruining Dinner because she taught Reggie in undergrad before Diana got in trouble at Westmont College and, left. But when you have a high quality student like that, you got to take credit regularly.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And Ilya Dilio is going to be there, who is mentioned multiple times in the book. A biologist, nun, and scholar of Teilhard.
A zesty nun. And Padre Gotuma, who many people know through the On Being project, a gifted poet and a person who invites many, many other people into poetry, and Ken Meadham, an unbelievably magical musician. So it's a great time people might enjoy. And if they can't come in physically, they can, get the live stream and recordings of it. Well, when I ended the book, I didn't think of this as a benediction, but it strikes me that, especially in light of some of the questions today, this could work. That this doesn't sound easy, say. There's not much certainty in what you offer. That is so true. But are either ease or certainty even options for us? being who we are, living when and where we live. In the absence of ease and certainty, what amazing things can happen. Life can happen. Wonder can happen. Faith, hope, love, unspeakable joy can thrive in difficulty and uncertainty. A new humanity, humble, just, and kind, can be born. Can you imagine that, fellow human? So, thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. It's always a joy to get to spend time with you. And having seen so many of the messages about this, plenty of people have benefited from all the work you put in this book. So, yeah. And if you're part of the group, definitely, if you want to use the videos later in a book group, go for it. The password and everything will still work and such.
And if you want to recommend the book to anybody, you can tell them it just was on Publishers Weekly Top 20 Religion Books of 2022. So that was nice.
I'm glad they made a good decision. And if you enjoy the online groups, the next one in Advent is with John Dominique Crossan, a rather legendary New Testament scholar, and we'll be looking at all the different Christmas stories in the Gospels and the history and all that kind of stuff, behind them. And he's got a cool Irish accent on top of it. So that's
he is a sweet and delightful and brilliant human being, all in one small package.
Yeah. So you can go to crossinthroughadvent.com if you want to join up, and the videos and everything will be on there if people want to use them for a group, if y'all enjoyed using these for a group. So yeah. All righty. Bye, everyone.